Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Data Chat Live. My name is Cameron Cowan and I am your host. Back with me after a little bit of a spring hiatus is Mike Fong. Say hello, Mike.
Hey Cameron, hi everyone. Good to be back.
Yeah, Mike, it feels like forever since I've had a chance to get on and just chat data with you. How have you been?
I've been great. I went on a holiday. My friend got married in Thailand. If Phil, if you're watching, congratulations again. But that was in March and April. Beautiful time of year to go to Thailand. So I highly recommend it.
Nice. Now, we haven't been completely offline. We've done a lot of data chatting as a combined effort. We've done a webinar with the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We also did one with the AMA. So we've been talking data a lot. We just haven't had a dedicated data chat live in a few months. So it's good to have you back on the line, Mike, and especially for today's episode. If any of you are regular viewers of the webcast, you'll know that this isn't our typical time. In fact, I want to have thanks to Mike for signing on late his time in the UK. Normally, I'm doing this in the morning, my time, and in the afternoon, Mike's time. And part of the reason for that is because we have some very special guests, and we're trying to coordinate across many time zones here. So I'm very excited to bring in our guests from our partner, DMPG. We have James Warren and Alex Peckham. Say hello to everyone, James and Alex.
Hey everyone, thanks Cameron.
Hello.
Good to see you again, Mike.
Good to have you on the line. Both James and Alex come to us from a couple of different time zones. That's what we're coordinating here. So we've got a couple people in the UK. We've got myself here in US Mountain Time, and we've got James calling in from Brisbane. What time is it there, James?
7 a.m.
Okay, and I know you're not especially a morning person, so the fact that we've got people making a dedicated effort to be on, it's great. Of course, this will be recorded and available to our entire audience. I know some people this just doesn't work for their time schedule, but honestly, we wanted to truly do data chat live. And as we looked at any combination of time zones, there's nothing that works especially well. So we figured this would land on the sweet spot. Now, the question is, why are we doing it at this special time? Why are we bringing in people from all over the globe? And it's because we're revisiting some research this month that we did 3 years ago. If you're familiar with some of the publications of ObservePoint, counting cookies was one of our best performing assets of 2021. And we'll talk a little bit about how that came about and how we developed it in partnership with DMPG. We'll talk about what we're doing to readdress those same questions and concerns now that we're in 2024. But before we get to that, I want to give our guests an opportunity to introduce themselves. James, I'll start with you. First, give us a little bit about yourself. Tell us what DMPG is and does, and how you got to your current position therein.
Yeah, sure thing, Cameron. So DMPG is a boutique sort of analytics and activation consultancy specializing in digital. We're all about helping our clients leverage data, get the most out of it to deliver business value. Often we're working in and around analytics, data collection, testing and optimization solutions, all the way across and through to the sharp edge of CDP architecture and implementation as well. So DMPG originally grew out of the UK. We're sort of beyond 10 years in now. We've pushed into the Australian market, which I'm forging the frontier on. And of course, most recently, we've moved into the US market as well. So pretty excited to be here, Cameron. It's been a while. Looking forward to getting stuck into it today.
Fantastic. And Alex, a quick intro from you as well.
Yes, hi, I'm head of engineering here at DMPG. I've been with the company about 7 years now, started out doing all the good things with data layers, moved my way into tag management on the client side. And then these days, my specialism is kind of combining all of those things really into sort of first party data collection, server side tracking, all that good stuff that hopefully we're going to get onto a little bit later today.
Fantastic. Well, I think we have the right people on to really dive into this and the markets represented from which our research was pulled. Now, before we talk about what we've done over the last couple of months to prepare for this, let's talk about where we've been for just a second. If I look at the announcement that Chrome initially made back in January of 2020, wow, that's actually the month before I joined ObservePoint. So it's been quite a while now. But they came out at that time and they said that they intended to phase out third-party cookies and that their intention was to do so within 2 years. And so sure enough, we were all thinking, okay, by the end of 2021, maybe early 2022, we'd be in this whole new world. And here we are even twice as long after that, and we're still kind of waiting for that shoe to fall. Part of what we prepared in 2021 was all about what is the risk? We figured, okay, 18 months in, we're expecting this change to come. So James, I remember working with you closely and saying, well, ObservePoint's got an amazing scanning engine that we can go out and look at a lot of websites, and just the know-how and analytical minds there at DMPG allowed us to dig into that data to find just some certain highlights. Can you give us just a brief overview about what the original research was all about and what are some of the key findings that we found therein?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like you said, it's going back a ways now into the dim and distant, but the whole topic around cookies had sort of reached somewhat of a fever pitch. And I think the thing that was most notable, however, whilst there was a lot of speculation, a lot of sort of fairly wishy-washy topical content at the time, there weren't really any hard numbers to sort of give us a steer, give us a sense of the scale and scope of this problem. It was then I turned to you guys, and we had conversations about what we could do in this area to sort of put some bright lights over it, start quantifying and scaling this sort of risk exposure and digging into this, along with our friends over at SimilarWeb to give us some of the rankings data. We decided then to go from there to pull the data, run across 3 markets, Australia, United States, and the UK, and really put numbers alongside the conversational topic so that we could really start to understand and dig into it. And we, of course, found at the time quite a significant exposure, wherein of the top 100 sites we looked at across the markets, fairly consistent data in the order of around 80%, give or take, of websites had and were exposed to a risk from third-party cookie domains. And it was from that we then dug a little further and categorized and classified the cookies that we saw in frame, quantified them, got really into the thick of it, and we're able to see quite clearly that there was a significant over-indexation, if you like, in the advertising category, perhaps as we might expect for cookie categories, wherein the writing was on the wall. So against this backdrop, of course, of Chrome, the sort of one of the top browser in the order of 2/3 of the universe of the internet using that browser, it represented a significant point for consideration for organizations. We looked at the top end of town, of course, as a proxy, with a working assumption that perhaps they had a good handle on things, they'd be ahead of the curve, they wouldn't have necessarily as extensive a exposure as that which we found. And of course, from that, we were then able to say, right, okay, well, what are the net implications of this? How does this affect us in terms of the measurement of marketing activity? How readily we can support targeting, retargeting, measurement of users across time, and any, of course, functional profile category risks as well, where third-party cookies came into frame and played a role in enabling the correct functioning of technology that we were looking at.
Yeah, so we looked, as you mentioned, at the top 100 most visited websites from these 3 specific markets. We figured it was a good cross-section, with the UK at that point having already been under GDPR for a number of, 3+ years by that point. The US had just started having their first state laws come out, with California announcing CCPA. Australia was a little bit more loosey-goosey, not a lot of tight regulations. So we figured we'd be able to see kind of what that looks like on various regions that had different regulations either in place or coming down. As you mentioned, though, we're north of 80% of all the websites across that top end of town, that top 100 in all markets that were ultimately having this exposure to third-party cookies. We already also knew, I thought it was interesting, that Apple through Safari and Firefox had already started blocking a lot of third-party cookies. So it's not like this was something that didn't apply worldwide to a lot of people. It's just it hadn't hit all browsers. And that's part of why we thought this was so topical, is that now as we are into 2024, we'd all expected by the back half of this year to really be at that full ramp of Chrome. We've since, just in the last couple of months, had them punt that date again, hoping that it sticks this time for the first half of next year. But it's a good time to revisit this research to see, okay, well, now that we've had a couple of years to respond to this information, to get our houses a little bit more in order, there's certainly a lot more regulation coming down in the US. I've been hearing some stuff about Australia as well. We'll get into that in a bit. But we wanted to revisit this and say, okay, how much have we improved as a digital community over the past 3 years? So James and Alex, you can pop in here as well. Tell us a little bit about how you guys then thought about revisiting this data. Were there changes to the methodology? And how do we try to keep baseline so we could see kind of time over time versus net new insights? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Cameron. And I think one of the things that we strove for was to promote comparability. So as far as best endeavors permitted, we sought to replicate as far as we could an exact carbon copy, so to say, insofar as the websites we scanned, in terms of the approach we used to crunching the data. And from that, of course, be in a relatively strong position to say, right, well, how have people traveled in that intervening period? What's been done? Has there been much movement on this? And one, of course, would reasonably expect that there would have been. 3 years is a long time in digital, of course. However, as we will see, perhaps there were some surprises along the way. And so beyond that, we didn't just want this to be a refresh, right? There's only so much interest in looking at then versus now. And of course, the Observe Point platform has evolved significantly in the last 3 years as well. And we've been working closely with you guys on some of those elements in the product roadmap, and it's been great to see. So as far as possible, Alex and I were racking our brains to think, right, what could we actually do that puts a deeper level of understanding around this? What other questions with this additional and enhanced data set could we get into? And I think one of the main aspects we sought to uncover, where in our previous piece of research, we looked at quotes, what we call default states. So the behavior of the crawler that we used in our research arriving on the top websites and just loading the page and looking at what tags and what tags were fired, what cookies were dropped. We also, at that time in the previous research, looked at the UK, of course, as you mentioned, Cameron, which had GDPR in frame and much greater emphasis, and of course, the legislative requirement that consent was in frame and consent management platforms and technologies. And of course, without getting into the interpretations of GDPR too far, it was interesting to start to understand how did that compare to the behavior when we actually configured the application and the platform with scripts to opt into consent management platforms as we encountered them, right? So not a light touch task necessarily from the perspective of back in the day. Much easier now because of course the platform makes that much more straightforward, as with some of the reporting and some of the data points that we now have access to that we didn't before. So we instead have gone to the full extent of doing across all markets both a quotes default state, that is to say no explicitly opted in actions, and put that alongside an explicitly opted in version. So effectively to see what was how did that stack up. We then also went a little bit further, some of the data points that we didn't have previously that enabled this slightly lighter lift than when we originally did this. It was a little bit more of a manual exercise. Of course, the platform automatically codifies and determines whether cookies are first party, third party, owned third party, and so forth. We were also able to look at some of the other data points, which we'll get into at the back end of today's session, looking at the associated technologies that we find coming from those domain setting cookies, and of course the initiators and so on and so forth, as we'll get into. But I think, yeah, hopefully we've replicated like for like as far as is humanly possible to promote comparability, the research that we previously undertook, and we've also gone a bit further and started to dig into the additional data points and really get under the skin of this. We'll also be looking at ITP, as you mentioned, and first-party cookies in a little bit more detail, with that as the point of reference and not to ITP, of course. We'll also look at cookie expiration for an interesting point that we looked at around cookie expiration for first-party cookies in the context, of course, of ITP and Safari's default 7-day expiration window that's applied.
Terrific. Alex, anything to add as far as just methodology or what you were thinking as we went into this research, questions that you were looking to hopefully get answered this time around?
Yeah, well, I mean, the most interesting thing is how much things have changed in the last 3 years. Maybe for the third-party cookie side of things have stood pretty still, it seems. But actually, we've seen obviously huge changes from the way that first-party cookies are being handled, what they're being allowed to do, and the way that people are starting to move away from cookies completely now, whether that's what Google have with Privacy Sandbox or data clean rooms, and all of these other techs that are now springing up. So it's been interesting to see, yeah, how we've been able to align that to what we're seeing in the data as we've gone through and processed it this time around.
Fantastic. Well, without further ado, then, if you want to see the original research, it's still published on our website. In fact, you can, I think there's a video recording of a younger looking James, although he's pretty timeless, and a much thinner Cameron, probably with more facial hair. But this time around, we want to focus on now what does that time over time look like and get into some of those new questions we were able to both ask and answer. So with that context, let's dive in first to kind of like the high level results. And this is really what the main question we were seeking to ask in both pieces of research is, what is the exposure? How many websites of the largest websites in these markets, how many of them, first off, have exposure to any third-party cookies being set, and by what domains, and to what extent, and in what consent states? So James, why don't you walk us through a little bit of this comparison of what we saw in 2021 versus what we're seeing this year?
Sure thing. So I think the first thing to call out at an overall level across the markets is our box on the top right hand side. So when we were looking at the third party cookie exposure, we were talking just shy in 2021, as we can see there, around about 82% round figures. And quite interestingly, in that intervening period of 3 years, I would have expected this profile to notably change, perhaps naive optimist as I am. However, what we saw, if putting that straight up alongside it, was just shy of that. So 2%, give or take, variation in 2024. So just shy of 80% there, 79.8%. I think the thing here to take away is, again, juxtaposing the one notable difference, as we'll get into in just a second, was the UK market. We did see, if you like, what an optimist might be hoping to see, which was an evident and observable signal that UK organisations have endeavoured and sought to make improvements to respecting consumer preferences, which is great to see. However, I guess equally, in contrast to that, and we can see here, we've got the 2021 as we start to look across to our bar charts by market, quite remarkably similar actually across the two periodicities that we've compared, so 2021 to 24. And we can see across the US in our first pair, AU in the middle, UK, noting it's an opted in, and we'll come back to why we've split this and laid this out in this way in just a second. But pretty consistent, around about 80%, no movement in the US market, fractional within the bounds of noise and some level of minor variation across AU, actually a slight increase there. And again, I guess one point to note is it just illustrates that there is, where we've run these crawls, the potential for tags to have been published in that period of time, and we're going to see some jostling and shuffling, which may give rise to some of the points here with 1 or 2% movements in either direction. So obviously it's a fluid state, right? This is a fluid environment. We're crawling, our crawls don't run concurrently necessarily, and therefore we actually see an uptick across the opted in and opted out, though we'll show that in the actual report. But again, where we're looking at this, the notable item is a fractional movement, again, from the UK move from 81% in 2021 down to 72%. Why we've put the opted in, so the explicitly opted in alongside the default state, as it were, for the US and the AU markets, is because effectively, on the face of it, these are the most comparable. The legislative requirement for the UK being that when you arrive at a site, you know, we over on the right hand side, where people haven't opted in, that's what we're going to be looking at alongside the opted in to make that determination. And so there's no significant difference when we actually got stuck into it across these markets between US, Australia, opted in versus default state. However, in the UK, which is the two right pairs that we look at, we can see quite a notable difference. So the opted in 2021 UK versus the opted in 2024, we've seen a move from 81 to 72%. And so therefore, there's been a minor movement here in terms of the risk profile where people have opted in. So a drop there around about 9% percentage points. In contrast, obviously, where we look at the default state, where in the UK, the right-hand most pair, we're seeing that effectively the number of sites setting third-party cookies domain, or third-party cookie domain setting cookies, drops down from what was 69% last time we ran this to 47%. So again, you can also see later in the deck where we actually look at the quantification of the number of cookie domains that we're seeing on average, the number of uniquely named cookies as well, that 47% belies actually quite a low volume in absolute terms as compared to the previous period, right? Again, quite a lot to
It's also a nice
unpack.
inflection point, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, when I look at fractions, I'm thinking, 69%, that's basically, a third. Whereas the 50, that's 2/3 of people still having 2/3 of the scanned websites still having third-party cookies back in 2021. And now 47%, that's less than a half. So like in my mind, when it goes from, 2/3 down to a half, it's kind of like an inflection point. You feel the momentum is really building there.
Yeah,
Absolutely, Mike. I think that's a great point. Back to you, Cameron.
And one that's also not to say that we have the same number of cookies, and we'll get into that in a second. This is just the percentage of all of those websites that have any third-party cookies. I think the other thing that sometimes people make the mistake of is they immediately hear third-party cookie and equate it to advertising. And we'll talk about categories in just a second, but not all third-party cookies are just for advertising. You'll see a lot that are in the functional or the targeting or other prescribed groups. You'll even see third-party cookies in strictly necessary bundles. So even if I have explicitly opted out in one of these markets, I'm still going to see some level of third-party cookies that show up, or at least have been categorized in that way and are being set for a specific purpose.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out, Cameron, for sure. And I think it also underscores the need to dig into the detail, right? So at an average view, it gives you sort of a size of the price, size of the risk profile. It's really when we then take this down to the next level or the next level down from that it actually becomes meaningful. And more importantly, to understand, to your point, whether on a categorization level, we're looking at functional cookies, which could materially impact the CX from a user perspective, as per marketing related technologies, where it's from a business and marketer's perspective going to be most important for driving efficiency. So again, depending upon who we're championing for and what the objective is in how we're looking at this, I think it's worth digging down and interesting to look at the next levels.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on from this high level finding, Alex, I want to spin it over to you. Obviously, being in the UK, and that's where we're seeing the biggest shift in this data time over time. Any perspective from you as you were reviewing this data and looking how it was changed over the last 3 years, as far as interesting data points beyond just the high level headline, and maybe any sort of thoughts on, being in the UK, why you think the shift is what it is, why it's not more or less?
Yeah, absolutely. So aside from just GDPR, obviously, which is reasonably vague when it comes to what we think of in terms of cookies and how tags get categorized on a website, we have the e-privacy directive going on, or PECR going on in the UK. And that adds a particular degree of strictness when it comes to how you go and classify and track people across websites. So as we've already alluded to, you have to categorize your cookies very carefully. And that's something that we at DMPG have spent a lot of time doing over the last 3 years with all of our clients. So it's not really a surprise to see these numbers dropping off. It is interesting to see that there are still some third-party cookies kicking around in a essential sense. I think when we are going to get into the high proportion of marketing that forms part of the third-party cookie use cases, but still, it's interesting to see that there's any really third-party cookies still being used in the essential sense.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that we're not going deep into these sites to get this data. It's not like I'm going into blog posts from 2017 to see a tag that somebody forgot about. We're just looking at the high level entry pages of all of these websites. So we don't have to go deep to find digital residue, to find tags and technologies people may not even know are still implemented on their website. Certainly cookies they haven't accounted for. This is just the gateway. If we were to go 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 pages deep on any one of these websites, I'm sure we would find even more than what we already have. Okay, now with that in mind, we've talked a little bit about this, categorization matters. Not all third-party cookies are for advertising, but let's talk a little bit about what we did see as far as how the cookie categorization shook out on this. You want to take that for us, James?
Sure thing. So I think we'll just give a shout out as a reminder for for people who haven't seen our previous research on this, the broad categories that we used in evaluating this and bucketing, if you like, the cookie domains that we were looking at. And again, obviously, on the left-hand side, a standout is the advertising category. We've also got some where they were unclassified, so best endeavors. In some cases, it's quite difficult on a site-by-site basis. You have to do this very manually. In best endeavors, we sought to minimize the number of unclassified cookies, but we still see an interesting residue there of in the order of 5-6%. Of course, other more interesting ones are measurement, category cookies categorized in support of measurement. We've got functional elements, those supporting personalization testing, and the necessary category on the rightmost side. And so I think in terms of the main call out here, it's pretty much as we saw last time, right? Advertising still dominates. There's a little bit of uptick here. So the exposure that we were seeing, or the percentage we saw back in a previous piece of research, was just shy of, on an average, 85%, and now we're nudging 86.5. So we've seen around about 1.6, 1.7 percentage point uptick, which, you know, at this level and with this type of distribution, doesn't really materially change the broad brush of what we took away from this. I guess the only notable item, the other second call out I was going to call here, is that measurement as a category, which is obviously a topic dear to our hearts and important to a lot of our clients, it saw a downtick from an average of 7.4 to 4.4 here, so around about 3 percentage points. And I think that's probably where the majority of the uptick in advertising, in terms of that percentage uptick, has been drawn across from measurement. So it's good to see that measurement isn't perhaps quite as dependent as it was at an aggregate level, fairly low here, as we can see. But ultimately, thinking about the net of this, the so what, we can sort of be fairly lucid and sort of direct and unflinching in evaluating the net impact of this from an advertising perspective. It's going to impact efficiency, right? And there's no getting away from that, other than obviously mitigating this and eliminating the dependency, of course. So it's going to affect our ability to target, retarget, attribute marketing spend accurately, and that washes through in aggregate to a point for consideration around efficiency, right? It's gonna have an effect. And it's interesting, we'll perhaps get into some of the alternatives to third-party cookie dependencies, some of those initiatives. I think Mike might dig into that in a little bit around alternatives, right? We're talking, there are a number of them, not least a hot topic at the moment is that of Privacy Sandbox from Google. And when we actually take third-party cookies out of the equation, what can we expect? What is the risk of doing that? What are the alternatives that we can consider beyond Privacy Sandbox, and where that currently sits in terms of its level of maturity? Then thinking about that residual sort of just shy of 5% from a measurement perspective, it's going to start anything where we need to support persistency of user identification, where we're wanting to deduplicate the number of people coming to our site, where we're wanting to persist experiences or personalized experiences across time based on behavioral points of reference or data points that we're bringing to bear in testing and personalization activities. We're going to expect to see some albeit diminished, but nevertheless notable performance impacts are there as well. And that's not, of course, factoring in ITP, which we'll come on to as a hot topic, even where we do have first-party instrumentation in place.
Yeah, and at first glance, I think one of my expectations maybe was that, well, surely we've learned more over the last 3 years, and we would want to reduce our dependency on advertising technologies and third-party cookies. But then as I kind of readdress this measurement and what we're seeing, it's still a proportional thing. So we see the measurement category actually go down. That doesn't mean there are fewer measurement cookies. It could just mean that they're not implemented in the third-party context. Alex, as you've kind of looked at that data, are you seeing a shift where what once were third-party cookies have been moved to other forms of measurement? So while they're still effective, they're just not showing up in this type of visual?
Yeah, we absolutely are, and particularly for the measurement space, as you say. And that's because really analytics measurement lends itself to first-party collection so much more readily. Therefore, it's always been available to make this sort of switch from third-party to first-party cookies. It's much easier to track someone just upon your own website. If you want to pass it across to different domains, you can link decorate. There's always that direct connection between what someone's doing and who they are, and how you then pull that into the analytics reporting. And that's something that we just don't have when we try to look at things from an advertising perspective. Seeing something on one site, buying it on another site, trying to make those rather tenuous links between what people are doing is something that we just can't solve in a first-party context yet. Therefore, we haven't been able to make that switch over from the third party when it comes to advertising technologies.
Yeah, and as I look at the way that we're seeing these categorizations, one of the other things I did research on just last night on our core data set, in fact, I don't think I've even shared this with any of you, is the uptick of CMP, consent management platform adoption, over these three markets. And what I saw was well over 90%, I think it was like 92, 93% were adopting CMPs, formal CMPs in the UK, we are hovering right around 50% in the US, and in Australia, it's still in the teens. So there definitely is a kind of a disperse approach to how you adopt consent management platforms and just consent management in general, whether it's homegrown or through an enterprise CMP. One other thing I wanted to quickly mention was we actually looked into not only the cookies themselves, but the technologies setting these cookies. James, I know you've seen a lot of the underlying data. This slide may be new to you, but the findings aren't. Tell us a little bit about some of the commonalities and differences as far as what are the most common technologies setting these third-party cookies today.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is it's the usual suspects, right? Without wanting to be flip. It's all of the big players that you would expect to see. Our Googles, our Trade Desk as audience manager, they've got the Adobe solution stack. And of course, a long tail distribution of all of the other sort of also rans as well down on the right hand side. So I think from my perspective, it's what we would expect to see. It's what we see working with our clients. It's the big networks, it's the big players in frame that dominate the distribution. And we have some other visuals when we were looking and chomping through the data on our side, where we were looking at that distribution. We don't have the slide today, but it's a very heavily skewed distribution towards the big end of town in terms of the publishers, in terms of the advertisers, and the associated MarTech ecosystem operators in and around measurement and retargeting and so on and so forth. So I think it's interesting to see as well. And this is something actually that we couldn't as readily do in our first time round. And it's really interesting and much more accessible now with the platform enhancements that we've seen in the last couple of years or so on the Observe Point platform front. And it really does make it much more intuitive and much easier to do this. Of course, Alex and I sort of inspecting Mike as well, inspecting network requests and going back to the dim and distant good old days that never were. We, of course, see our usual actual domain level network requests going out, but it's only through obviously experience and blood, sweat and tears that you start to identify what does this cookie domain actually pertain to. And some of them are more intuitive than others. However, I think this makes it really easy, really accessible. And of course makes from a marketer perspective it a much more intuitive exercise in going through and doing these types of audits and digging into the data and seeing what do we need to work with, who do we need to go and have conversations with, who do we need to migrate from third to first party or direct integration on a server side where possible.
Yeah, it's one thing to say, hey, I found a bunch of cookies that aren't in my CMP that I don't have categorized or legal hasn't reviewed. But if I don't recognize where they're coming from, what those network requests are that are setting them, it's really hard to track them down and decide, should they be there, who owns them, what value are they bringing to the business. Just because it's a third-party cookie doesn't mean it's not driving economic value. It could be in that bucket of strictly necessary, and I just don't recognize it, or somebody else implemented something new. So being able to get down to that level of what is the individual vendor, actual technology, the network request, all of that is important as you're running an ongoing cookie compliance program for sure.
Exactly.
Now,
And I think there's one last point I'd just make there, Karen, is it
yeah.
used to be the case when we were doing these types of audits that, of course, you would have to go and do a lot of desk research. You'd have to look at, I mean, as we say, some of them are pretty intuitive. We know if we see double click in frame, it pertains to Google, for example, and so forth. However, when we're actually getting down to the row item level, perhaps some of the less common or less obvious or proprietary in some instances or customized sort of instrumentations, it became a really tedious and protracted exercise, going back to when we first ran this research, often to do exports, to do a reconciliation, to make sure our cookie policies were up to date, to actually look at what the net implication, and then of course trawl through the documentation to say, right, well, what is the net impact of this cookie for this technology, or what are the cookies associated with this technology, and triangulating, trying to work out what was what. Much easier now. And it's great to see, and I think this time around the research and the update was a lot faster.
Agreed. Now, we're going to spend just a moment digging into the data. Obviously, there was a ton more to this research than some of the top level findings we've hit on already. Just from a high level, Alex and James, what are some of the things you noticed that you want to highlight? This whole paper is going to be published in the coming weeks, so everyone's going to get a copy of the entire research. But if you had to highlight 2 or 3 other things that you found deeper into the data, what were you finding? What was interesting?
So I'll shoot on this one first. I think for me, and again, it's, you know, we've sought to work around the potential floor of averages here, right? So we look at the top level, we see it's around 80% sort of exposure. We then look at the categories, see, okay, it's around 86% are advertising oriented. but that sort of conceals a multitude of details, right, which we need to get into. So when we actually think about, okay, look, we get the writings on the wall, we get that it's a wide scale problem. What is the actual associated lift with going through and auditing this? And that's what we've sought to sort of address and outline with the stats we've got compiled in this table. And if we just take the mean average across all of the regions we looked at, the average number of cookie domains on any given website we would expect to see, noting the distribution skews alluded to with our max here and our median and so forth, it's in the order of 27 domains, right? So that's typically how many domains the average website that we looked at would need to go and investigate, and associated with that there were sort of 52 uniquely named cookies, right? So that gives you an idea of how many items, row items in our spreadsheet or in our documentation and whatnot are we going to need to loop through. And noting that whilst the aggregate level numbers, that sort of overall risk profile percentage was broadly similar 2021 to 2024, the numbers actually are quite different at an average level from 2021 to today. And we saw an average 27 that we're seeing today in terms of the cookie domains was around 20 when we looked at this previously. So an uptick, 20 to 27, almost a half of the number of cookie domains we're seeing in Frame. And in terms of the total number of uniquely named cookies, it went from 37 on average to 52. Now, I think what this really speaks to is that whilst actually the numbers conceal a multitude of sins in terms of the aggregate level, when we look into the details, if anything, there's actually been an uptick. We haven't seen a reduction in the total number of domains and technologies in Frame. We've seen an increase, similarly with the number of cookies. And that's what we're going to need to sort of prepare ourselves for any given client site when we're doing an audit and we're digging into this. That's what we can expect. So more than a few hours to work through that, but pretty intuitive now that we have the enhanced feature set in platform.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, in amongst all the noise, what's been interesting is seeing some of the vendors who have been sneaking out of the picture here as well, generally tending to be the vendors who have their own walled gardens to speak of that they could go and run and hide in. So, for example, in your last slide, we didn't see Meta up there at all. And that's speaking, I think, volumes to the CAPI efforts, the conversions API that they've been, pretty much using with all of their partners now, and being able to take hash data, ingest it into the platform, rely on that massive ecosystem that they've got to do the identification rather than needing to stick with third-party cookies. So yeah, we might be seeing these sort of trends may be going up slightly when we look at the overall data sets, but it's interesting to see that there are certain big names here who have kind of snuck off and left the party at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that you've been especially conscious of, what does that shift look like from third party to first party and from things that are setting on the client versus information that's being collected server side. Are there any high level trends, whether in this research or separate from it, that you're seeing as people try to migrate from one extreme of third-party cookies and tracking to first-party and even server-side?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, it's a never-ending race, is what we're seeing at the moment, because it started out with being quite a simple thing. I'll just move all of my data to first-party, and then I can set my cookies there. I'll just set them on my site. Anything can do that. That'll keep everything good forever, right? And then the next thing we see is that's no longer good enough. I need to move server-side, and now I need to be on I need to have a tag management platform sat on the same domain as my site that's going to set my cookies for me. So I'm not just first-party cookies, I'm now server-side first-party cookies. And then we see ITP coming in, changing the race even further, where they say, right, okay, but actually I'm still going to limit you to 7 days or even 1 day if I detect that you're setting those cookies, even if it's the same domain. If your server isn't in the same location as your site server, I'm still going to limit those cookies. So we're seeing this constant arms race going on at the moment, even in the first party cookie space, where it's not, you need to be a bit careful when you think that you're just going to go and solve this problem by switching to a different solution, because the race is definitely not over yet. There's still a lot of, I think, different challenges that the browsers are going to throw at us over the next few years.
Yeah, it's a great point that each of the browsers have taken a slightly different approach. In fact, when Google made their initial announcement about deprecating third-party cookies back in 2020, they took a couple not so subtle jabs at Apple and what they had done with Safari years before with ITP. For the uninitiated, Alex, give us just a real quick overview as far as what is ITP and what are the implications for people that are setting cookies on that browser.
Yep, of course. So intelligent tracking prevention, as it's called, is essentially a means to limit the types of cookies that can be set on a browser initially, and then for how long they can be set for. So this applies to first-party and third-party cookies. And this was introduced quite a few years ago now, and we've seen a few iterations. I think we're now up to ITP 2.3 at the latest count, which has been with us for a while now. And in its latest guise, it is essentially preventing the setting of any third-party cookies. And then if you are setting in a first-party context, you need to be super careful. Anything that's being set from what's called script writable means. So I won't get too deep into it, I promise, but essentially first-party cookies being set on the client side by scripts or local storage, that's being limited now to 7-day expiries as well. And so this is why I sort of jumped the gun and started talking about server-side cookies, because that's really the last area that ITP hasn't quite put the squeeze on just yet when it comes to being able to set cookies for an extended period of time.
Yeah, and there's a lot there to unpack. So let's see if I can hit a few of those things in order. And I brought up this chart because, James, you and I have been talking about this a little bit. You had some sneaking suspicions about duration, and especially in light of ITP, which has not just from a third-party cookie perspective, but even from a first-party cookie perspective, limited our ability. We also know that through, it was mentioned earlier, the e-privacy directive out of the UK and the limits on how long consent can and should last for that market, that has a duration of 12 months. And yet we see cookies that get set for a whole lot longer than any of those durations. James, talk to us a little bit about the analysis you did on duration of cookies.
So yeah, what we did here, and we had a sneaking suspicion that this would be the case, right? But where you obviously consider that Safari, depending on where you pull your numbers from, is in the order around 18% of browsers, give or take. It's a notable chunk of your potential user base. And so what we sought to, and therefore ITP is relevant for those users, and we're looking at a 7-day window effectively. So what we sought to do here is to look at our third-party technologies, setting first-party cookies, and we looked at the average expirations. And so what we did was we looked at a count of the total and then a further sort of cross tab looking at those which were setting cookies with an expiration greater than 7 days. And that's what we're seeing in our table here. So if you look at the fourth column, we're seeing, other than one or two exceptions of the technology and related tags that we had in frame, majority of them are actually setting all of their cookies with an expiration greater than 7 days. And then we've taken a median of that as an average over on the right hand side to say, well, okay, well, what does that actually look like? And so you can see a lot of top running technologies here, well over the 1 year mark as well, to your last point. And I think it's notable that I think in a lot of cases, marketers perhaps may not be quite as attuned to the fact that even though they're setting a first party cookie, and even though the expiration of that cookie may be set to whatever, anything above 7 days from an ITP perspective is going to get its legs chopped off. So before it gets beyond that point. And so therefore, again, it comes back to anything where there's behavior that we want to profile, persist, understand that extends beyond a 7-day periodicity, you're going to be sailing into the unknown, and it's not technically possible where the browser is chopping the legs off, as I said. And so therefore we need to think about what are the implications for that. And so the implications from a measurement perspective, of course, are going to be inflated user numbers, right? If we look to 2 weeks to a month, a lot of product focused organizations looking at their monthly average users, for example, even in first party context, they're only going to be seeing deduping at a 7-day window where they have first party implementations, of course. And of course, marketing, same story as we were talking about with third parties, the efficiency is going to drop, our ability to attribute, our ability to retarget behaviors that extend beyond a 7-day consideration phase. So I think, and it's also interesting to see, I mean, this is just the top 10, right? We had a list, I think, of some 70 or so technologies we looked at in frame, just looking at this research, which in the broader ecosystem of the internet is a pretty small sliver, but nevertheless representative. And I think it's interesting to see that a lot of different technologies here for different use cases are going to fall foul of this. And so to Alex's point, then we need to start thinking, and I know you and I talked about this a while ago, Cameron, around, are there workarounds in terms, or alternative instrumentation approaches that move to the server side? Is that in itself introducing a risk as well? I think you were the one that made a point to me, because I was thinking, well, okay, that's what we're shifting our sort of viewfinder on towards, but it remains to be seen, of course, and I don't want to get into speculation, what the legislative eventually, when they
Please
catch up and
speculate.
see.
I want to hear
A little bit, maybe. Well, as of course, eventually there will be this sea change move, and when these sort of event horizons are reached, we're going to see a potential additional risk profile. Everything's been moved to the server side. What happens when one of the big legislative bodies turns around and says you can't use, if they were to, server side instrumentation for persisting identifiers or persisting and supporting retargeting for that use case? If they were to turn around and you've hedged all of your bets and sort of betted the farm on that pathway, then you're going to be in warm water pretty quickly, right? And so we've got, and we don't know what in Australia we've got in August. We're expecting some updates to the privacy legislation over here, the Privacy Act. It remains to be seen what that actually is going to entail, and it's been emergent still. It remains to be seen what the EU, they're pretty aggressive and proactive on this stuff, when they start to realize that all of this these moves to server side, and that ultimately favor the walled gardens in some way, shape or form as well, and not the consumer, potentially, in respecting consumers' consent preferences. They may well come down with a big axe or something and introduce legislation that curtails that or eliminates it. It remains to be seen, but that's another point for consideration.
Yeah, almost as many people, and I think this probably comes out of Europe more in my discussions with our customers. They do have that concern. It's like, yeah, server side may be a way to get all of this off of the browser, and so I no longer have these third-party cookies that are being set on a web browser. But what happens, Alex, you just mentioned it, we've had ITP pretty static for the last couple of years, but they were going through a lot of iterations, fast and furious, for a number of years, trying to essentially close all the loopholes. They close something and then people would work around it, and then close something and then people would work around it. And what happens in the eventuality, if legislation comes down that says, you know what, you've got more opacity than you've ever had before. We can't see, once it goes to the server, where it's going after that. That's no bueno, and we're going to actually cut that off as well. That does get into speculation, but that is a possibility. So I think more than anything, I'd encourage our listeners to understand the technologies and what they're trying to do first and foremost, whether they're doing it through cookies or local storage, first party or third party, client side or server side. Understand the critical nature of your investments in your tech stack to your business, and then take the most appropriate actions. Even when people say, I'm going server side, that usually means they're taking one or two or three technologies. Not every single part of my marketing stack is now going through a server side implementation. So I think there's a lot of nuance in there that we don't talk about a ton as an industry, but it's worth understanding as you dig into this data. Now, Mike Fung, I'm going to bring you in here for a second because we haven't had nearly enough words from you today. A lot of this research, I've been kind of in the midst of it with Alex and James over the last couple of months. Some of this is net new to you. As you see this with kind of fresh eyes, is there any kind of high level things that stick out that you want to make sure we highlight before we sign off for today?
No, you're putting me on the spot.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just looking at this chart here, I'm thinking, 400 days cookie expiration, timeline. At what point is that just laziness? Did Google just think, we'll just leave it like 400 is the default, so we'll just leave it at the biggest possible we can? Akamai is at 7 days, so is that because they know that they're just a page performance, so they don't need any ongoing kind of stitching of a unique identifier? I don't know.
Yeah, well, and we also know that these are medians, so by the nature of math, the way I understand it, that means there's a number that are a lot longer than these as well. So just because that's 400 for the median, we may see things that are being set for 2, 3, 4 years that are never even going to come close to living that long. Or if they do, they may be in violation of certain regulations that are upon you, depending on the jurisdiction. The other softball I was hoping you'd catch, and that's one that I noticed as soon as we pulled this up, is right here at number 2, Google Universal Analytics Loader. And number 4, we've got another universal tag. James, you called this out to me. There's still a fair bit of digital residue in all of this data and what's on websites. What have you noticed from that perspective?
Yeah, and I think it's something Mike and I talked about previously, right? It comes back to the fact that, you know, tag ecosystems need ongoing love and attention, right? To the, nothing's getting simpler, nothing's getting more straightforward, right? And I think this is where needing tools to support the management, oversight, and understanding of what's at play and what's in frame is important, because obviously universal analytics is long gone, and therefore there's a legacy debt associated and performance impact potentially with having legacy tags in frame. And of course, the OP platform as well helps us understand load performance of tags and these kinds of things, right? So you can actually quantify that. You don't need to guess. However, you know, I think it underscores the fact that if the top end of town, which typically are well funded, well resourced, they've got big teams often, are still leaving old tags floating around, then, you know, ultimately that's going to some degree impact page load performance. And obviously there's research abounds around the correlation between page load performance and suboptimal commercial outcomes, right? So the faster your page, generally speaking, the better. Therefore, you know, remaining vigilant, keeping an eye on these, cutting out and removing legacy tags is something that there's clearly an opportunity for. And I think it's often it's not a sexy topic necessarily outside of the realms of tech teams, but web performance is the other side to this as well, where we've got a lot of greedy technologies, third-party technologies in frames that are setting cookies for various reasons. We need to keep a weather eye on that. We also need to eliminate them when we no longer require them, or potentially put logic around when they are firing and when they're deploying a little bit more judiciously, perhaps, than just dumping everything everywhere, which can, of course, slow down websites.
For sure. Now, as we approach the top of the hour, and I recognize it's a different hour for each one of us, Mike, want to check in with you. I know you've been keeping an eye on the chatbot. Are there any questions that have come up that we haven't answered over the course of our discussion so far today?
No, the audience have been quite quiet today, so we have no questions.
I got to imagine if anybody's signing in from Australia, first of all, hello and very early morning
Good
to
morning.
you. If you're in there from the UK, I hope you're well caffeinated and staying up into your late night. With that, then I'll turn it to kind of final thoughts. Alex, I'll start with you as we wrap up, and obviously we're going to publish a full set of information, findings, and reports. As you look at this body of work more broadly, what are the recommendations that you are offering to your clients of DMPG as far as what should they be doing from here? We expect that we're not in the world of the boy who cried wolf, and Google will eventually deprecate their third-party cookies, maybe the first half of next year. What kind of guidance are you giving to the clients you're working with?
Honestly, the guidance is that there's no catch-all solution here for this deprecation that we're seeing. So everything we've spoken about today should not be viewed in isolation. It all needs to be used together. So whether that is moving as much of your tracking as possible to some sort of more robust means, whether it's server-side or whatever comes after that, keeping an eye on these technologies as they're developing, continuing to maintain a first-party data strategy in terms of cookies, continuing to look as closely as possible at new solutions for capturing first-party data and encouraging your own users to identify themselves and give you that data freely. So we've worked closely on a lot more CDP projects recently, people who are really desperate to start harvesting a bit more data about customers in a compliant manner, but that can help them to build out their own audience lists, do their own retargeting in ways that maybe third-party cookies aren't going to be able to service for much longer. So first-party cookies, server-side CDPs, and sort of data modeling from that aspect. And then really keeping an eye on what is going on with the Competition and Markets Authority at the moment. Privacy Sandbox is one of many. Apple have, of course, their own solution as well. So we as developers are going to have to really keep on top of this. We're probably going to end up developing about 3 or 4 different things for clients just to maintain this sort of concept of third party going forwards. So yes, in summary, a lot of different things to really keep an eye on, and certainly no one solution to date anyway.
Yeah, it is an incredibly dynamic and ever-evolving environment. No matter which jurisdiction and country you're in, there's always something to keep on top of. James, to you, any last thoughts, any sum up findings, and what direction are you giving the clients you're working with?
Yeah, I think Alex has nailed it. I think the one of the main takeaways for me is that this is something where there's a high risk if you're caught napping, right, of potential downside in terms of the efficacy of measurement and advertising and customer experiences in digital channels. I think the order of the day is ongoing vigilance. I think it's getting up and over this, looking at this on your site-by-site basis to determine and evaluate what's going on, what's in frame, what can we do, and putting together, to Alex's point, a strategy. I think also looking at how can organizations compete on trust, how can they actually, beyond compliance, actually differentiate with empowering consumers, with giving them the ability to manage consent, and looking at zero-party data, as in value exchange between the consumer and businesses, and people proactively offering to identify themselves or provide information to drive relevancy in their experiences, to enable businesses to help the customer, right? So it opens out into a whole much bigger topic, perhaps for another Data Chat Live. But I think, yeah, there's certainly a number of pieces to unpack there. And of course, to pick the right technology platform partner in supporting with the lift on some of that. And indeed, making sure that the quotes pain of doing this manually is minimized as far as possible.
It's great guidance, and we're thrilled to have partners like DMPG to help out our mutual customers get to those better spots, to have better digital hygiene, to take advantages of new measurement capabilities, of really getting themselves squared away. Part of that's technology, part of that's having the right people and processes in place to take advantage of the opportunities that lie. Real quick, Mike Fong, I would be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to chime in. You're always coming to these with all kinds of things you're observing from the market. In our last minute or two here, are there any high-level things, either takeaway from our discussion today or just general information you want to make sure our audience is aware of before you sign off for today?
Yep, that's my favorite part of this. Giving the current affairs. So Cameron, you shared the 2020 slide where Chrome announced that they were deprecating third-party cookies, and we've talked about the rolling delay. Well, the Competition and Markets Authority is a UK government organization that ensures that Google doesn't have an unfair advantage. And for the last year, part of the rollout of the Privacy Sandbox has involved testing by their industry peers. And very recently, that testing period came to an end in June of this year, and there were some pretty surprisingly large numbers, surprising improvements to Google's share of revenue, shall we say, from advertising. And yeah, we haven't got enough time to go fully into it this time, but I think an absolute we'll leave the audience on a cliffhanger for today.
Nice. Well, it's something we can chat about in the future as we get through more Data Chat Lives. I'll leave you with the fact that Observe Point is going to be all together and in person again this year at our Edge event here in the US. That'll be held in Utah in late September. And then we'll be convening our first Edge event in Europe. So we'll be over on your side of the world, Mike, as we hit Lisbon in mid-October. So we'd love to see any of you there. If you're up late from the European markets, come join us in Portugal in a couple months. If you're signing in late in the afternoon from the US, we'd love to see you here in Utah. And hopefully we can get out to your neck of the woods, James, and do something meaningful in Australia, not too far in the future.
Would that be Observe Point?
Observe Point? Yeah, we'd have to switch some letters there. All right, well, as we sign off, Alex, if people want to get a hold of you, if they want to reach out, learn more about the research you're doing, is there a good place online for them to do that?
Yep, well, start with our website, dmpgteam.com. I'm always happy to speak to people directly as well. My email is alexp@dmpgteam.com, and you'll find me on LinkedIn through those sorts of means as well. And yes, please do start up a conversation. I love nothing more than chatting about cookies.
Fantastic. And James, if people want to hit you up for more of your insights and expertise, where can they find you?
Yeah, definitely. Please hit me up on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of myself, Cameron Cowan, my buddy Mike Fong, and our special guests, Alex Beckham and James Warren, we really appreciate you guys coming on today. It's been great collaborating on this research, being able to chat about data. And until next time, we'll see y'all later. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.